I felt a stab of disappointment and looked away so Pa wouldn't see it in my face. I knew he'd had to trade a wheel of our homemade cheese, some dried beans, some animal pelts, and some money on top of that to get me my fiddle. I couldn't expect to get a knife, too. I handed it back to Orrin Beckwith without a word, but I felt like somehow he knew how much I wanted it. It unsettled me to think he could see right through my skin to the inside. I wished I could do that, instead of wondering all the time what folks might be thinking. Then Orrin Beckwith said, "There must be something here I can tempt you folks with." With a flourish, he opened up the pack all the way up. Molly ran over, squealing with excitement. She exclaimed over each and every splendid item Beckwith took out and spread on the table for us to see. There are cards of buttons and papers of pins, hooks and eyes, and spoons, bowls, plates, rings, brooches, washboards, liniments for horses and for people, too. There were shoelaces, silk and cotton goods, Bibles and almanacs, handkerchiefs, candles, seeds, caps, gloves, and mittens. If I hadn't seen it all come out of the pack, I'd have bet money, if I had any, it would never fit back in. Molly was sniffing a cake of sweet-smelling soap and running her fingers over a shawl Orrin Beckwith said came all the way from China. Suddenly, Beckwith looked at Pa, who was working a pair of scissors in the air, getting a feel for them. Pa was squinting his eyes to get a better look. Orrin Beckwith's expression almost grew crafty. "You a reading man, Mr. Fowler?" "Yes," said Pa. "Now that you mention it, it's getting harder and harder for me to make out the words." I looked at Pa with interest and some worry, too. "What do you mean, Pa?" I asked. "Well, say you use your ma's quill and ink to write something, and then a drop of water fell onto the paper. The ink would spread out and make the letters all wiggly," I said. "It's what letters look like to me these days," Pa explained. "I have trouble with what's right in front of my face, but I can see clear across the far pasture just fine." He gave a little shrug. I tried to imagine what it was like to see all wiggly. "Mr. Fowler," Orrin Beckwith said, breaking into a big grin, "if you'll step right over here, I believe I will be able to fit you with some spectacles that will solve this troublesome problem in the wink of an eye." He laughed at his little joke, and then untied a cloth pouch and unrolled it. Inside were about 10 pairs of carefully wrapped spectacles. "There are 5 different strengths," he explained. I heard in his voice that he was proud to have such fine wares. It's a matter of finding the right strength as well as the proper fit. "Please," he added, gesturing for Pa to help himself. I watched as Pa put on one pair after another. Molly handed Pa one of the Bibles from the pack, and with each new pair he moved the book closer, then farther, then closer again. That's better," he'd say, or, "These make my head spin." Finally, he said, "Well, now isn't that something?" He continued reading for a while, then he took off the spectacles and said, "Mr. Beckwith, I thank you. Some day when we're all saved up a bit, I aim to get me some of those specs. In the meantime, I reckon I can see well enough." The cabin was real quiet for a minute except for the snapping of the log on the fire, and I figured Molly and I were both thinking the same thing. We wanted Pa to have those spectacles, but unless every corn plant had 3 ears of corn come harvest time, I didn't see how it was going to happen. "We'll take some of that indigo and some madder root," said Pa, "and I expect that'll be it for this trip, Mr. Beckwith. Sorry you had the trouble of coming all the way out here for such paltry a sale." "Oh, thank you, Pa," Molly said. As she gave Pa a hug, my eyes caught a pile of handbills and broadsides that had fallen out of Beckwith's pack. Isaac had always carried such papers with him, too, so we could see the words of the latest songs and read whatever news somebody had thought to print up. Orrin Beckwith said, "Go ahead, have a look." I paged through the stack of papers. The first ones were all songs. The titles made me laugh. "The Lawyer Outwitted," and "The Old Maid's Last Prayer." Then there was one called Confession. That wasn't music at all, but the last words of a man who was about to be hanged for murder. I wonder who would want to read such a thing. The next sheet looked interesting. At the top, in real big letters, it said, "Not to be missed." Reading on, I saw it told about a traveling show. See human oddities, curiosities, and monstrosities. The price of admission is 1 dime, 10 cents only, merely the 10th part of $1, featuring Calvin Edson, the human skeleton. It said that this feller Edson was the world's skinniest man, which I thought might be something to see. Next it told about little Miss Mary, who was a grown-up lady only 2 feet tall. I thought I might like to see her too, as well as the amazing Amelia. She was only 9 years old and weighed over 400 pounds, which I reckon was quite a lot. There was a person called Pea-Head Pete and another name of Bearded Betty. But before I could read more about them, I saw something further down the page that made me cry out in horror. Pa, Molly, and Orrin Beckwith all turned to me. "What is it, son?" Pa asked quietly. I didn't want to say the words I'd seen. It was like speaking them out loud would make them true. Wordlessly, I put the paper on the table and pointed. "See the white engine, a man with no name and no tongue, deaf and dumb. From whence did he come? Savage or civilized folk? Women, children, and those of faint hearts, be warned." "It's Ezra," I said into the terrible silence. "Who else could it be?" "Pa," Molly wailed, "it isn't Ezra, is it?" She looked at me, saying, "Ezra isn't Dove. He has a name, and he's not an Indian." Pa had picked up the paper and was peering at it intently. I couldn't believe I had noticed before that he was having trouble reading. When he had finished, he put his hand on Molly's shoulder and looked at Mr. Beckwith. "What do you know about this?" he asked. Orrin Beckwith looked flummoxed. I believe I was given that in western Pennsylvania," he said. "By who?" I asked. Orrin Beckwith gave me a wary look, likely because of the anger I could feel creeping into my heart and my voice. "Who gave it to you?" I insisted. He shrugged. "I can't say. A man was handing them out. I can't recall what town I was in. I'd forgotten I even had it. Where is this show headed to?" He shrugged again and looked away from me to Pa. "What's got you folks so riled?" he asked. When no one answered right off, he said, "Who's this fellow Ezra, anyhow?" Pa sighed, like the question made him feel sad. "Not that it's any of my business," Orrin Beckwith added, but it was plain he was curious to know. Pictures ran through my mind. I saw Ezra leading Molly and me through the forest to his wigwam, a shelter made Shawnee style with poles and sheets of elm bark where he was healing Pa's wounds. I saw Ezra teaching me to throw his hunting stick. I saw Ezra cleaning a turkey and making stew and blue biscuits. Didn't want to tell Orrin Beckwith about Ezra, even if I could find the words. It seemed to me that Ezra's story belonged to him and to us, not to Beckwith, someone we'd only just met. Pa said wearily, "He's our friend. He saved my life when I was caught in a trap. He's not Shawnee, but he took up their ways. Last we knew, he was headed out to Indian Territory to find his kinfolk." I was glad Pa didn't say the whole truth, that Ezra Shawnee's wife gives light as she walks and her unborn baby were killed by a man named Weasel, and that Weasel cut out Ezra's tongue for saying that Shawnees were people just as good as us white folks. I heard the story from Weasel himself, the night he had me hogtied in his cabin before I escaped. Those awful memories never went away, hard as I tried to put them behind me. Pa, Molly, and I didn't speak about Weasel for after Ezra left in the spring. Instead, we talked about how Ezra had most likely found his wife's family. We like to think that the Shawnees welcomed him and took him in. We pictured Ezra happy and peaceful at last. But that picture was shattered now. I saw Ezra standing on the bed of a wagon, a sign over his head calling him the White Injun. I imagined people pointing and staring, laughing and poking at him, trying to get him to open his mouth. Pa, I said, I've got to find him.